Have you ever wondered what it takes for a man to find his humanity again when he's lost everything that once mattered? In the unforgiving landscape of 1880 Arizona territory, where the sun scorches the earth and survival depends on steel nerves and quick reflexes, one broken cowboy was about to discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. This is the story of Thomas McKenna, a man who had given up on life until fate placed a dying Apache woman directly in his path, forcing him to choose between walking away or finding a reason to live again. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The desert wind carried dust and memories across the cracked earth as Thomas McKenna guided his weary horse along the rutted trail between Tucson and Phoenix. 3 days of hard riding had left both man and beast exhausted, but Thomas felt no urgency to reach his destination. There was nothing waiting for him there. No job, no family, no purpose. At 42, he had become a ghost drifting through a world that no longer seemed to have a place for him. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, its heat shimmering off the rocky landscape dotted with saguaro cacti and scrub brush. Thomas pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes, feeling the familiar ache in his chest that had been his constant companion since the fever took Sarah and little Emma 2 winters ago. The small ranch they'd built together near Prescott had been sold to pay the doctor's bills, leaving him with nothing but his horse, his gun, and a soul as barren as the desert surrounding him. His horse, Buck, nickered softly and slowed his pace, ears pricked forward. Thomas looked up from his melancholy thoughts to see what had caught the animal's attention. There, perhaps 50 yards ahead near a cluster of mesquite trees, something dark lay motionless on the ground beside the trail. As they drew closer, Thomas felt his breath catch. It was a person, a woman, by the looks of her long black hair spread across the sandy earth. She wore the traditional dress of the Apache, though it was torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. Her face was turned away, but he could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Thomas dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the colt at his hip. Relations between whites and Apache had been tense throughout the territory, with raids and reprisals creating an atmosphere of constant fear and mistrust. Finding an Apache woman alone and injured could mean many things, none of them necessarily good for his health. But as he approached, he saw she was young, perhaps 25, and clearly in no condition to pose a threat. A crude bandage around her upper arm was soaked through with blood, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. Her breathing was labored, and her skin had the grayish pallor that spoke of serious blood loss. Thomas crouched beside her, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for other wounds. A bullet had grazed her arm, leaving a nasty gash that needed immediate attention. Her ankle was swollen, possibly sprained from a fall, but it was her fever that worried him most. Her skin burned with unnatural heat despite the desert sun. "Ma'am," he said softly, though he doubted she could understand English. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, dark brown eyes filled with pain, and something else Thomas recognized all too well, the look of someone who had lost everything. She stared at him for a moment, seeming to take in his appearance, the worn denim pants, the faded blue shirt, the holstered gun. Fear flickered across her features, and she tried to push herself away from him, wincing as the movement aggravated her injuries. "Easy now," Thomas said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're hurt bad. I'm not going to hurt you." She spoke then, a few words in Apache that he couldn't understand, but her tone was defiant despite her obvious weakness. Thomas admired that, the refusal to give in even when facing what might be death. He looked around the immediate area, noting the tracks in the sand, unshod horses, Apache ponies, but also the deeper impressions left by cavalry mounts. The story wasn't hard to read. Soldiers had attacked, probably a small group of Apache trying to reach one of the reservations. This woman had either escaped or been left for dead. Thomas found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to mount Buck and ride away. Getting involved with Apache affairs could bring down the wrath of both the cavalry and any surviving Apache warriors looking for their missing woman. He had nothing left to lose, but that didn't mean he was eager to die. Yet as he looked down at her fevered face, Something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. A sense of purpose, of responsibility for another human being. This woman was dying, and he was the only one who could help her. Damn fool thing to do, he muttered to himself, but his hands were already moving to his saddlebags to retrieve his medical supplies. Thomas worked quickly but carefully, using water from his canteen to clean the wound on the woman's arm. She remained conscious but silent, watching his every move with wary eyes. When he began to stitch the gash closed with needle and thread from his kit, she bit down hard on a piece of leather he offered her, determined not to cry out. "You're a tough one," Thomas said, impressed by her stoicism. "My name's Thomas. Thomas McKenna." He pointed to himself as he spoke, hoping she might understand the gesture, if not the words. She studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "Aiyana," she said, her voice hoarse from thirst. Then, surprising him, she added in heavily accented English, "Thank you." Thomas felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "You speak English?" "Some," Aiyana admitted, accepting small sips of water from his canteen. "Mission school when I was child." The admission explained much. Many Apache children had been sent to mission schools in an attempt to civilize them, though most eventually returned to their traditional ways. The fact that she could communicate made things easier, but it also made her more real to him somehow. Not just an injured stranger, but a person with a history, hopes, and fears. As Thomas fashioned a proper sling for her injured arm, Aiyana told him what had happened. She had been traveling with her brother and 2 cousins, trying to reach the San Carlos reservation, where the rest of their band had been relocated. Cavalry patrol had spotted them and assumed they were raiders fleeing back to Mexico. In the firefight that followed, her brother and cousins had been killed, and she had escaped into the desert only to collapse from her wounds. "They will come looking," she warned him. "Soldiers. They think I am dead, but if they find tracks." Thomas nodded grimly. The cavalry wasn't known for asking questions first when it came to Apache. If they found him with Aiyana, they would likely shoot first and sort out the details later. "Can you ride?" he asked, glancing at the sun. They had perhaps 4 hours of daylight left. Aiyana struggled to sit up, her face pale with the effort. "I can try." Thomas helped her to her feet, noting how she favored her injured ankle. She was stronger than she looked, but clearly in no condition for hard travel. They needed shelter, somewhere safe where she could recover her strength. As he helped her onto Buck's back, settling her in front of him in the saddle, Thomas found himself remembering the old mining cabin about 10 miles north of the trail. He'd sheltered there during a storm 2 years ago. It was isolated but had good water and enough game nearby to keep them fed. More importantly, it was off the main routes used by both cavalry and Apache war parties. The ride was torture for Aiyana, though she never complained. Thomas could feel the fever burning through her clothes, and twice he had to steady her when she swayed dangerously in the saddle. Buck seemed to sense the urgency, picking his way carefully across the rough terrain toward the hidden canyon where the cabin waited. By the time they reached the old mining claim, the sun was touching the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The cabin was exactly as Thomas remembered, a single room built of stone and timber, with a stone fireplace and a small spring bubbling up from the rocks nearby. Thomas helped Aiyana inside and made her as comfortable as possible on his bedroll near the fireplace. Her fever was worse now, and she shivered despite the desert heat still radiating from the stones. He built a small fire and set water to boiling, then went outside to tend to Buck and gather what medicinal plants he could remember from his wife's teachings. Sarah had been part Cherokee, raised by her grandmother who knew the old ways of healing. She had taught Thomas about the desert plants that could ease fever and infection. Now, as he searched the canyon for willow bark and desert sage, he felt her presence with him for the first time since her death. Not the crushing weight of grief, but a gentle guidance that steadied his hands and cleared his mind. When he returned to the cabin, Aiyana was delirious with fever, speaking rapid Apache interspersed with fragments of English. Thomas brewed the willow bark tea and managed to get some of it down her throat, then bathed her forehead with cool water from the spring. As the night deepened and her fever finally began to break, Thomas found himself talking to her, not expecting answers, but needing to hear a human voice in the wilderness silence. He told her about Sarah and Emma, about the ranch and the dreams that had died with them. He spoke of his aimless wandering since then, the way each sunrise had seemed like a burden rather than a gift. "I reckon I was just waiting to die," he admitted to the unconscious woman. "Didn't much care how or when. But finding you, maybe there's still something I'm supposed to do in this world." 3 days passed before Aiyana's fever fully broke, and she was strong enough to sit up and take solid food. Thomas had used the time to hunt rabbits and quail, gathering wild greens and making the cabin as comfortable as possible. Each day brought small conversations as her strength returned, tentative exchanges that gradually revealed the people behind their circumstances. Aiyana told him about her childhood, split between the traditional Apache way of life and the mission school where she'd learned English and Spanish. She spoke of her husband, killed in a cavalry raid 3 years earlier, and the daughter she'd lost to the white man's diseases. Her brother had been her last family, and now she was truly alone in the world. "We are like you and I," she observed on the 4th morning, watching Thomas prepare breakfast over the fire. "Both ghosts, walking in a world that no longer has place for us." Thomas looked up from the cornmeal he was stirring, struck by the accuracy of her words. "I reckon that's true enough. Question is, what do ghosts do when they get tired of haunting?" "Perhaps they learn to live again," Aiyana suggested, accepting the bowl of porridge he offered her. "If they have reason." Their conversations ranged widely, from practical matters of survival to deeper questions about loss, purpose, and the possibility of finding meaning after tragedy. Thomas found himself looking forward to these talks. The way Aiyana's perspective challenged his assumptions and offered new ways of seeing the world. She told him Apache stories, not the supernatural tales he'd expected, but real accounts of her people's history, their struggles to maintain their way of life in the face of relentless pressure from white settlement. Thomas shared his own experiences, the loneliness of a man adrift after losing everything that had given his life structure and meaning. On the 5th day, Aiyana was strong enough to walk to the spring unaided, though she still favored her injured ankle. As she knelt by the water, Thomas noticed how she moved with unconscious grace despite her injuries, a reminder that she came from a people who had lived in harmony with this harsh land for countless generations. "Thomas," she said as they sat by the spring in the afternoon shade, "you saved my life. This creates debt between us." "No debt," Thomas replied quickly. "I did what any decent person would do." Aiyana shook her head. "Among my people, life debt is a sacred thing, cannot be dismissed with words." She was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at him. "But perhaps debt can become something else. Partnership." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of partnership?" "You say you have no purpose, nowhere to go. I have same problem." Aiyana's dark eyes were serious, but held a spark of something that might have been hope. "But I know these lands, no plants and animals, no places where white men never go. You know white man's world, how to deal with soldiers and settlers and people in towns." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "There are others like us, Apache who cannot live on reservation, white people who don't fit in towns, people who need guide through wilderness, who need someone to speak for them, help them find safe places." Thomas considered her words. It made sense in a way. The territory was full of people caught between worlds, mixed blood families, prospectors and traders who worked alone, settlers trying to establish homesteads in dangerous country. A partnership between someone who knew the Apache ways and someone who could navigate white society might indeed fill a real need. "It would be dangerous work," he said. "Soldiers might shoot us on sight, thinking we're spies or raiders." "All life is dangerous," Aiyana replied. "Question is whether danger has purpose." That evening, as they shared a meal of rabbit stew and wild greens, Thomas found himself studying his companion's face in the firelight. The fever had left her thinner, but somehow more vivid, as if the brush with death had burned away everything non-essential and left only the core of who she was. Her injuries were healing well, and she moved with increasing confidence each day. "There's something I need to know," Thomas said finally. "If we do this, if we become partners, what happens when you find your people again?" The Apache who are still free, I mean. Aiyana was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. My people are scattered, she said eventually. Some on reservations, some fled to Mexico, some still fighting in mountains. But fighting is ending. Too many dead, too few left to continue. She looked up at him. Maybe time for new kind of life, new kind of survival. Thomas nodded slowly. He understood what she was really saying, that the old ways were dying, and those who would survive must find new ways to live. It was the same choice he faced, in a different form. We'd need supplies, he said, and realized as he spoke that he'd already made his decision. Good horses, weapons, medical supplies. And we'd need to establish contacts, people in towns who could send word when someone needed guides. Aiyana smiled, the first full smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, revealing the woman she must have been before tragedy carved its lines around her eyes. I have some silver hidden, she said. Payment for horses and supplies. And I know a trader in Tucson who deals fairly with Apache. He might help us get started. As they planned through the night, Thomas felt something awakening in his chest that he'd thought was dead forever. Hope for the future, excitement about tomorrow. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was looking forward rather than backward. 2 weeks later, Thomas and Aiyana rode into Tucson just after dawn, when the streets were still quiet, and the harsh sun hadn't yet begun its daily assault on the desert town. Aiyana wore one of Sarah's old dresses that Thomas had retrieved from his saddlebags, her long hair braided and partially hidden under a worn bonnet. To casual observers, she might pass for a Mexican woman, the Spanish she'd learned at the mission school adding credibility to the deception. The trader Aiyana had mentioned, Miguel Santos, operated out of an adobe building near the town's outskirts. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and the careful manner of someone who had learned to navigate the dangerous currents between cultures. When Aiyana spoke to him in rapid Spanish, his eyebrows rose in surprise and recognition. Aiyana, but they said you were dead, Santos said in accented English, glancing nervously at Thomas. Nearly was, she replied. This man saved my life. Now we work together. Santos listened as they explained their plan, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. Finally, he nodded slowly. There is need for such services, he admitted. Many people come through Tucson who need guides they can trust, not just through the desert, but through the complications of dealing with different peoples. He told them about a German family trying to establish a ranch in Apache country, needing someone who could help them avoid conflicts with the various bands still free in the mountains. There was a group of Mexican silver miners who needed safe passage to their claims near the border, and a missionary couple seeking to establish a school that would serve both Apache and Mexican children. Dangerous work, Santos warned, echoing Thomas's earlier words. Many people on both sides will not understand what you are trying to do. We know, Thomas replied, but maybe it's work that needs doing anyway. They spent 3 days in Tucson, using Aiyana's silver to purchase supplies and better horses. Thomas found himself marveling at his partner's skill in negotiation. She could switch between Spanish, English, and Apache as circumstances required, reading people's intentions with an accuracy that came from a lifetime of needing to understand which way the wind was blowing. Their first job came from Santos himself, guiding a small wagon train of Mormon families to a settlement site near the Gila River. The route would take them through territory claimed by both Apache bands and Mexican raiders, requiring careful timing and knowledge of safe campsites. As they prepared to leave Tucson, Thomas felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. The old mining cabin had become their base of operations, and they'd cached supplies there for the work ahead. But more than that, it had become home, a place where two lost souls had found each other and decided to build something new from the wreckage of their old lives. The Mormon families proved to be good traveling companions, hard-working, disciplined, and grateful for competent guidance through dangerous country. Thomas handled the interactions with any white travelers or cavalry patrols they encountered, while Aiyana's knowledge of water sources and safe routes kept them moving efficiently across the desert. On the 3rd day out, they encountered a small band of Apache warriors watching them from a distant ridge. Thomas felt his stomach tighten, but Aiyana calmly rode out toward them alone, her hands visible and empty. The conversation that followed was tense but brief. She was recognized, and after explaining their mission, the warriors allowed the wagon train to pass unmolested. "What did you tell them?" Thomas asked when she returned. "Truth," Aiyana replied. "That we guide people who seek peace, not war. That we take no sides except survival." She paused, watching the warriors disappear into the rocks. "They think we are both crazy, but they understand crazy better than they understand hatred." The Mormon families reached their destination safely, and word of Thomas and Aiyana's success began to spread through the network of traders, missionaries, and settlers scattered across the territory. More work followed, some dangerous, some merely challenging, all requiring the unique combination of skills and knowledge they brought to the partnership. Months passed, and Thomas found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The constant focus on immediate survival and the needs of others left little time for brooding over past losses. The work was physically demanding and mentally challenging, requiring him to learn new languages, customs, and survival skills. Most importantly, it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his family's death. Aiyana changed too, growing more confident in her interactions with white society while maintaining her connections to the Apache communities they encountered. She began to speak of the future, not in terms of survival, but in terms of possibility. One evening, as they sat by their fire at the mining cabin after successfully completing a particularly difficult job, Thomas found himself studying his partner's face in the flickering light. The gaunt desperation that had marked her features when he first found her was gone, replaced by something stronger and more hopeful. "You know," he said, "I never did thank you properly." Aiyana looked puzzled. "Thank me? For what?" "For giving me a reason to get up in the morning," Thomas replied. "For showing me that two broken people can build something worthwhile together." She smiled, the warm, genuine smile that had become familiar over the months of their partnership. "Perhaps that is what healing looks like," she said. "Not forgetting the broken places, but finding new ways to be whole." As winter approached and the desert began its subtle shift toward cooler temperatures, Thomas and Aiyana received an offer that would change everything. A territorial official in Phoenix wanted to hire them as official mediators and guides, working with both the cavalry and Apache leaders to establish more peaceful relationships. "It would mean leaving this place," Thomas said, looking around the cabin that had become their sanctuary. "Living in towns, dealing with politics and bureaucrats." "But it would also mean helping many more people," Aiyana pointed out. "Maybe preventing some of the killing, the endless cycle of revenge." Thomas nodded slowly. The work they'd been doing on a small scale could have much greater impact if supported by official authority. It would be dangerous in new ways, political rather than physical, but the potential for good was enormous. "Together?" he asked. "Together," Aiyana confirmed. As they began making plans for this new chapter in their partnership, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He'd found Aiyana dying by the roadside, a stranger from a different world. In saving her, he'd somehow saved himself, not through any mystical transformation, but through the simple act of choosing to care about another human being's survival. Their story would continue, he knew, through whatever challenges lay ahead. They had both learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that loss didn't matter. Instead, it was about finding the courage to build something new from the broken pieces, to create purpose and meaning in the face of tragedy. The desert wind that had once carried only dust and memories now seemed to whisper of possibilities yet to come. Thomas McKenna was no longer a ghost haunting the ruins of his old life. He was a man with work to do, a partner who understood the weight of loss and the value of hope, and a future that stretched ahead like an uncharted trail, dangerous perhaps, but full of promise. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.